we're even dealing with issues of just basic anthropology and divine design. Even if I just backed up a touch, we talked about government and politics and trying to define those things. I might define government as, the exercise of divinely delegated authority. So there's government in your home. Civil government, I would argue, is a different sphere. It's outside of the home. And then when we talk about politics, we're talking about kind of the art and science of exercising divinely delegated authority in the civil sphere.
Welcome to another episode of NFBC Today. Good to have you all here with us today. Each and every one of these episodes that we do, I hope is going to be very helpful to you. It's going to hit on something important, something practical, and today's is no different. We may not do a lot of these, but I really hope that each and every one will be helpful to you, and as a result of that, also something you'll be thankful for. So, and I want to bring in guys that have a perspective, that know their stuff, that know the Lord. And today's guest is Christopher Leduc. Him and I went to seminary together, and it has been years since we've talked, and we were just catching up. And I graduated in 2017, and Chris, you were in 2018, right?
That's right.
That's right. So, so it's been a long time since we talked, but I saw Christopher on YouTube having some videos on politics, what the Bible has to say to political issues. And so today we're going to be talking about political involvement. This is kind of a controversial issue amongst believers, but a very important issue. And Chris has a lot of good stuff to say regarding political involvement, what the Bible has to say. I'm going to have some hopefully good questions here for him today. But Chris, why don't you introduce yourself, tell our audience a little bit about yourself. Like I said, it's been years since you and I have seen each other. We couldn't even remember the class. I think it was one of the counseling courses. But how are you doing? What have you been up to since you graduated seminary? And how's your family? Just give everybody a little insight into your life and how you're doing.
Yeah. Well, it's a treat to be able to talk with you and hopefully be a blessing to the church. That's what we gave all those hours for in seminary, was to be a blessing to the church.
Good
point. Speaking of seminary, I left a year after you did, and while I was there, I did an internship with Grace Advance, which was church planting and church revitalization. And so I was at the seminary 4 years. 3 of the years I was working at Grace Church in that internship. And so when I graduated, I went to Cannon Beach, Oregon, and did a church revitalization for about 5 years. And then about 2 years ago, we were visiting my in-laws, as we would do every summer, and just kind of noticed that there was the somewhat normal need to help parents out. And I realized that there really wasn't anybody else that could do that other than my wife and I. And so we kind of rolled up the ministry there in Cannon Beach about 2 years ago. And thankfully another TMS brother is now out there. But we kind of rolled up the ministry and moved to my wife's hometown outside of Philadelphia, and bought a new place, moved parents in with us. And so we're doing the multi-generational thing, which is sweet. and just seeking to be faithful in a local church, another like-minded church. It's about 35 minutes away down in Delaware. And so, it's interesting for, you and I leading the church. There's a sense in which we understand the blessing it is to let me say it a different way. I don't think not until you're on the receiving end do you really recognize how important a good local church is. I recognized when I was pastoring that we were a blessing to our people, but it's not until I moved out here and there's really only one church I would want to go to within 35 minutes, which is where we're going. And so now I have such an appreciation for that church where I can take my kids. The word is taught and taught clearly and soundly. And so there's a sense in which I have this new appreciation that I didn't have when I was the one doing the teaching. And so anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting because you went from being a church member to being a pastor. I mean, a pastor is still a member, we understand, but it's a different role. And now you're no longer the lead pastor again, and so to kind of have those that shift of viewpoint, to kind of be back in the pew listening. Not that you're not involved. I understand you're very involved, but to be back and listening and realize how important it is to get that good teaching. I know that when we'd taken a couple weeks off and visited a couple different churches on some time off I had, and just how refreshing it was to sit under the Word and to appreciate that perspective. I know there was a time I was sharing with my wife. I love being in a pastor role. I love it so much, but in some ways I miss sitting and listening. And there's a blessing on both of those angles. So, yeah. Well, maybe like I said, my wife's family's from Lancaster, so maybe we could catch up with you. That would be really cool.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let me ask you this too. Like I said, I had caught some of your videos on politics, let's just say politics from a biblical perspective. And then I had seen you on the Conversations That Matter podcast with John Harris. That's a fairly well-known podcast, and I've been listening to it for a long time, and so I heard you on there. Thought you had some good things to say. What got you into this topic, and what would you call it? I've been calling it politics according to the Bible, but do you have a name for it, this specific topic? Because I think you believe it's a topic that's not getting enough attention, especially maybe in kind of the circles we came from. What would you call it, and where did you get this passion for it, and this studiousness, this attentiveness to this particular area?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, I guess kind of the umbrella term maybe would be political theology. Okay. Or biblical political theology. So I've been working on a YouTube series, the basics of biblical political theology. And I think what really got me into this was, this wasn't really part of our training in seminary. There was so much that we needed to learn, languages and sure, historical theology. And we probably needed to learn a lot more, but they can only keep us so many years. This was an area where we didn't really get to it.
I took 6 years. Don't pick on me.
Well, I took 4. So,
well, that's normal.
You know what? And they were sweet. They were sweet years, right? I mean, if I could have extended them, I would have. But yeah, we didn't really get into politics too much, and so really for me it was 2020, and when the government started telling all these churches to close down, it contradicted the doctrinal statement that our church had, which we had adopted Grace Community Church's doctrinal statement. And, the church is an autonomous entity. And so there was already, for me at least, a little bit of the seeds of the concept of sphere sovereignty, that within creation there's these differing spheres, and they're autonomous as it relates to each other, though there's a little bit of overlap, and Christ is Lord over all of them. And so that was really when 2020 happened, and these commands went forth to shut everything down. It seemed that by and large, most of us were kind of uncertain on what to do. And our default was, hey, let's go to Romans 13. Romans 13 tells us to be in submission. And so they're telling us to shut down. Let's shut down. And, we just like you were studying in some of your studies in the patristics, we all have a historical context. We all think according to that historical context. And, we came out of a generation, last couple generations where we had a generally good government that looked after our best interests. And so it was natural to just assume when the government says, hey, close down, everybody's going to die. Hey, they've never given us real reason to disbelieve them. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and trust them. And as time went by, it became more clear that, well, maybe we've forgotten our biblical anthropology just a little bit, that man is depraved, right? There's none righteous, no, not one. And and maybe they're not actually as altruistic as we've been giving them credit for. And so, that's what really got me involved in studying political theology. And then just, some books that I read kind of early on. One of them, I don't even remember which book, and that's part of the problem. I'm scared to do any more advanced studies because, I'm the product of reading so many things. I don't know what I learned from who and where anymore. And so, but, one of the books I read, it just pointed out when you think about how God relates to us and how he reveals himself to us, he is a king. And he's created a kingdom, and our Lord is king, and he's Lord, and he gives us his law, and he judges, and we are lawbreakers. We are condemned. And then we are transferred out of the kingdom of darkness and brought into the kingdom of the beloved Son. And all that is law language. It's all political language. And so I think there's a sense in which we don't even realize how political the Bible actually is, and how political God's relationship with man is, such that he is that king. He is the lawgiver. He is the judge. He is the executioner. And so, and that made me kind of realize, wait a minute, I think there's a lot more going on than we think about.
Right. Well, that's great stuff. And I'm going to just transition right into the first question here. And I'm going to just add something to it, because the question originally, and as I originally sent it to you, was, should Christians be involved politically? What does that mean and why? A very general question, and I still want to ask that. But there's another related question, or with a related question to that, and it's, should Christians talk about politics? Should are pastors forbidden to talk about politics? And I don't want to get ahead of your answer, but like you just...
Hey, I'm sorry for 1 second. My 3-year-old broke in here, and
sure. Yeah.
I got to kick him out. Elijah, you want to come over and say hi to Mr. Sam? He's going to have to edit this out real quick. Come here, little man. This is my 3-year-old. He's a wild one. You say hi?
Oh, that's all right. Hi. What's his name? Eli?
This is Elijah. Yep.
Yep. Hi, Eli. How are you? Welcome to the program.
Okay, you're gonna go back outside so that Daddy can work. Okay. Well, love you, buddy. Hey, don't come back in. All right, I had that door locked for a reason. No, it'll be later. Okay. All right, love you, buddy.
We're definitely not editing that out, if that's all right. That's a great moment.
I've actually got a key code on the door, and I think one of the older kids showed him what the code was, and so he just punched it in, and here he is.
Oh, that's too precious.
Okay, so sorry, I interrupted your question.
No. The first question: should Christians be involved politically? What does that mean and why? And then another side of that would be the question: should Christians talk about politics? Should pastors talk about politics in the pulpit? And I don't want to get ahead of your answer, but as you have kind of hinted at, and I actually hinted at this past Sunday, there is a political message in the Bible. Jesus is king. So that's one thing we have to consider. What do we mean by politics? You know, if people mean, I don't think, if by politics they mean having a rally for a particular candidate every Sunday, of course not. Though I don't think that means you can't talk about people that are running. But it's a loaded question, is all I'm trying to say. So, should Christians talk about politics? Should they be involved in politics? And what does that mean? Because last thing I'll say, brother, there is a little bit of a real negative sentiment from a lot of Christians. Oh, forget politics, don't talk about politics. And certainly people do get obsessed, but should we just forget politics? I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you having multiple good questions is indicative of the reality that there's a lot of factors that all tie in together here. It's complex. It's complex in one sense that there's a lot of factors, a lot of different topics. But if you just take them one at a time, it actually gets a lot easier. And it's kind of like untying the spaghetti bowl. It looks like a mess, and if you just go one at a time, it's actually not so bad. So even if we think about politics, we're talking about, I might define it this way, we're kind of talking about the exercise of authority. And so all of mankind has authority from God kind of over the earth. And then our authority generally tends to grow. If you have kids, if you have any employees under you, things like that, you're delegated authority, and you have to exercise it in a certain way. And that happened, pre-fall. There was divinely delegated authority with Adam and Eve. And there's a difference between power and authority, right? So you think about power being the ability, and then authority being, say, the authorization to command somebody else. So for example, Adam and Eve had the power to eat from the tree. They did not have the authority to eat from the tree. And so for all of mankind, God has generally given us more power than we have authority to use. And every time we sin, we're using our power in ways that we're not authorized. And so Adam had authority over Eve. He names her, he renames her post-fall. Adam is our head before we're in Christ. And so pre-fall, there was divinely delegated authority, and that creates authority in the home. And then eventually, it's hard to pinpoint when civil authority developed, but it's an outworking of essentially familial authority. One family grows into multiple families, and before you know it, you have many generations all together, and the natural outworking was kind of patriarchal. And, civil government's going to continue even into the new heavens and the new earth. If you look at Revelation 21, verses 24 through 26, it talks about the New Jerusalem and how the kings of the earth will bring the glory of the nations into this New Jerusalem. So we'll still have civil government, we'll still have nations and people groups in the eternal state, but civil government at that point won't be coercive. There won't be any need for, punitive, coercive government, which is what the fall brought about. It will probably be more kind of administrative, right? Because we won't be omniscient. We won't know what everybody's thinking. And so we'll still require some degree of leadership But so when we talk about politics, really what we're talking about is people exercising authority. And so we should be involved in politics, for a variety of reasons. So that's a really long introduction to the answer. And, feel free to interject and interrupt at any time. Okay, so
Yeah.
when we talk about politics, the fall introduces sin, and after the flood, God authorizes, or I would say commands, the use of the sword as a deterrent to evil. And so I think there was already civil government in one sense before the flood, but after the flood, now there is the exercise of capital punishment, and we should even be clear there. Post flood, so you think about the first murder. It was in the original family, Adam and Eve and their kids. Well, had that happened again with Noah and his sons, the first murder, who would have carried out capital punishment? Well, it wouldn't have been civil government. It would take a couple hundred years post Noah to have what we know of as civil government. So it would have been familial. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of rabbit trails we could go down here.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we ought to be involved in politics in authority for a variety of reasons. We're all accountable to God for whatever stewardships we have, and so that would be one argument. And here's how I would make that argument. You and I, particularly, Sam, we were born in America. And as I think you were born in America, I don't have any reason to think otherwise. We were born American citizens. And maybe even before I go further, let me back up. One of the reasons I think that we don't have as deep a political theology, maybe as we ought, is we tend to forget that the New Testament didn't address political theology because, by and large, all the people that are either writing the New Testament or receiving the New Testament, they're not voting citizens in a constitutional republic. Most of them are subjects. They don't have the obligation, or they don't have the right to vote for city council. They don't have the right to vote for their governor or their senators. They don't have the right to vote for Caesar. And so those type of issues weren't really addressed in the New Testament just because it wasn't a reality for them, in the same way that, they didn't talk about the printing press in the New Testament or Twitter. And so we tend to forget that the New Testament is absent a lot of that discussion because it just wasn't an issue. Now, for us, we need to be faithful in the situation in which we've found ourselves. We were divinely ordained by God to hold the office of voter. You and I were born into a place and time in which I'm a voter, and seats in representative groups are based upon population. And so my existence actually is counted and accounted for. And so I have this stewardship. I have this stewardship to exercise my office of voter in a way that best represents the Lord in the options that I'm giving. And I also have this obligation to love my neighbor as myself. And so laws that are an expression of morality. Laws that are an expression of how we love our neighbors, right? The speed limit is set at 35 or 45 because somebody has determined, hey, it's unsafe and therefore unloving to go faster, right? You need to stop here because if you don't stop at this point in time, you're going to cause an accident, and that's morally wrong. That's unloving. And so we have this stewardship to love our neighbor through law because we're office holders, we are voters, and we're not all going to be great at this naturally. But if we stop and think for a moment, as those who've been born again, who have the Spirit of God, we have the mind of Christ, we have the Word of God, who better than to come up with righteous laws than the people of God? I mean, how could we possibly ever think that the God haters, the depraved, are the best at coming up with righteous, equitable laws in ways that are going to express love for our neighbor? That's just, that's not to say unbelievers are as bad as they could be. There are many unbelievers that are on the horizontal plane. They're upright people, right? You think about all of our military people that are willing to sacrifice greatly, even though they don't know the Lord. Nevertheless, we understand the mind of God and we have the Word of God, and so who better then to be involved in governing our neighbors than us? Okay, so I'll pause there because I can just go
Yeah,
on.
no, that you're you just you this is very exciting. I hope everyone enjoys you as much as I do, because this is good stuff, man. One thing, you said something about even government being at the family level, and I just want to throw something out there real quick, and then I'll just give the more general principle / question, something like that. But like everyone says, big government is bad, okay? And well, we see that. We see what happens when you have a big government with too much power, little accountability. But small government isn't necessarily better. Like just imagine things where imagine if every family was its own government. I don't know about you, Chris. I love the Wild West. I love Gunsmoke. I love that era. But that is an era where big government was lacking, right? And you had basically a lot of people governing themselves, kind of a judge's situation. And that's not necessarily good either. When the Lord comes back, He's going to have a big government, but it's going to be a righteous government. So those were just, some thoughts to think about. But let me just kind of bring it back to home. That was kind of just an aside thought, and you can comment on that if you want.
You're right.
But let me just throw this out real quick. If we define politics, politics comes from the Latin word polis, right? City. So, the matters of the city. But if we could just give a basic definition of politics, politics, or maybe not politics, but government. I know they're related, but this whole general concept, what we're talking about, right, is keeping order in society. And if you just boil this down to the most basic definition, simple idea possible, like when we're talking about all this stuff, we're talking about keeping order in our society. So like, yes, of course Christians should care about keeping order in society, right? And then, as you mentioned, we're in a situation where as a citizen and as a voter in the kind of republic that we have a direct hand in that. So why in the world wouldn't we care? Why would we not? Do you care about the politics of your family? Do you want order in your family? Why wouldn't you want order in your country? So is this what we're talking about? Is that a good, and you can disagree with me or ask for clarification, but is that a good basic level idea of what we're talking about? Like, do you care about keeping order in society? Is it good for Christians to have a role in keeping order in society? Is this kind of what we're talking about at the base level?
Yeah, and we're even dealing with issues of just basic anthropology and divine design. Even if I just backed up a touch, we talked about government and politics and trying to define those things. I might define government as the exercise of divinely delegated authority. So there's government in your home. Civil government, I would argue, is a different sphere. It's outside of the home. And then when we talk about politics, we're talking about kind of the art and science of exercising divinely delegated authority in the civil sphere.
In the civil government.
I think maybe that would be, Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, and that sphere could be as big as our local community, or even as big as our entire nation. Um, and there's so much we could cover. You mentioned big government, small government. One of the things we need to do is we should be able to go to Scripture and make the positive case for what government ought to do. And I think that can actually be done in one sense. We can set the guardrails pretty easily. So even if we go to a text like Romans 13, it tells us that we pay taxes for this very reason, right? So I just have my Bible open to Romans 13. Um, it says Romans 13:4, it's a minister of God to you, which is interesting, right? It's a minister of God to you, Christian, for good. If you do what's evil, be afraid, doesn't bear the sword in vain. It's a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it's necessary to be in subjection, not only because of that, or because of wrath, but also because of conscience. And then Paul goes on to say, for because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what's due: tax to whom tax, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And so if we pause there for a moment, we have to pay our taxes. The civil government has the divine authority to levy taxes. Now, why do they have the authority to levy taxes? Well, we can actually construct a biblical kind of theology of government just from Romans 13. So they have to bear the sword. That is the execution side of things. In order for them to do that effectively, think about what has to happen. The government, the civil government, first needs to be able to publish legislation. They have to be able to publish, hey, here's the laws, here's right, here's wrong. If you do wrong, you're going to be in trouble. Now, we're not saying they get to define right and wrong, but they have to publish it. They don't get to define it. That comes from God. But they have to publish it. So now we have the idea of a legislature. We need legislatures who publish the law. And then my understanding of government is that their authority, in all these spheres, in your home, in different places, their authority is triggered when there is what I would call a human rights violation. That's a whole other topic. God does give us human rights that are tied to our obligations. I'm obligated to worship God and to obey God. Therefore, I have the right to obey and worship God because I'm obligated to do those things. I have a right to govern my home as God commands me. And nobody's allowed to come in and keep me from doing that. And when a rights violation occurs, that should be against the law. The legislature should have published that. When there's a rights violation, I need to be able to raise my hand and say, hey, the law's been broken, my rights have been violated. You need to come look at this. Then you need an investigative body. So we need a legislative body, and taxes are going to fund that. Taxes need to fund an investigative body to determine, hey, has a rights violation actually happened? And then that investigative body needs to be able to turn over the results of their investigation into a judicial body where they can try that evidence. And then that judicial body needs to be able to ultimately declare and render a verdict. And then on the basis of that verdict, if it's guilty, there needs to be another body that carries out the punishment. And so I think it's clear from Scripture then that the civil government has the divine authority to levy taxes for the purposes of funding a legislature, funding an investigative body, funding a judicial body, and funding some sort of a body to actually carry out punishment. And so, how big that needs to get is a question. But at the bare minimum, I think we need to recognize God does have certain things that He's granted to the government to do. We need to support those things. We need to encourage those. We want them to do what God's called them to do, right? So there's a little bit of a rabbit trail.
No, that's good. No, this is a lot of good stuff, and I'm gonna be definitely listening to this again because I think this is good stuff. Let me turn to the next question that we were going to talk about. There's
Yeah.
doctrine of the lesser magistrates, maybe give a brief definition of that, but why don't some Christians like this teaching, and how do we connect it to Romans 13? And all I'll add to that is COVID, the whole COVID dilemma really got us to rethink Romans 13. Was Romans 13 teaching blind submission to the government in every and all circumstances? That's kind of a question, a theme a lot of people looked at. So how does the doctrine of the lesser magistrates relate to all this? Why don't some people like it? And first of all, what is it?
Yeah, that's really good stuff. So the doctrine of the lesser magistrates is tied to a doctrine called interposition, to interpose, to stand in between. And essentially what it is, it's very simple. It's the idea that in probably any governmental system, there's a hierarchy of magistrates, those who bear the sword. There's the highest level, and even Peter speaks of this in First Peter. That we're to be in submission. Whether it's to kings or those sent by kings. The idea of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate is that let's say you have it's kind of like middle management. Each step on the ladder, they have divinely delegated authority. They have the rightful use of the sword, and they are to use the sword for the protection of the people under them. That's what we want our police officers to do, right? They carry a gun. Somebody's trying to break into my house. I want to be able to call, and I want them to use that sword to the fullest extent as necessary, either as a deterrent or even worse if necessary. Well, the doctrine of the lesser magistrate recognizes that sometimes the threat is actually the higher magistrate. Sometimes the threat isn't somebody from the outside. Sometimes it's upper management. And so you could see this, for example, a very simple negative example would be what we have with sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities, they're running on the doctrine of lesser magistrate. They're saying, okay, wait a minute, it's my job to care for the people under me, and the people above me are trying to violate the rights of the people under me. I am going to stand in the way and defend my people from the people up above me. That is my obligation. And so it's a biblical doctrine, but it's a doctrine that goes, way back into Rome. And so quite simply, it's the recognition that the lesser magistrate has the obligation to bear the sword against really any enemy of the people that he is protecting, even if it's somebody higher ranking than him in his own government. We saw this, I think, during COVID with certain governors, standing up to the federal government. I think we saw this with Ron DeSantis a little bit, right, saying they wouldn't enforce certain things. And so that's essentially the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. Now, I think the reason sometimes Christians either don't like that or don't understand it is because we don't think about categories as clearly as we ought. And it's not hard. It's just we've never had to think through this stuff. So, for example, Sam, when you're in the church, you have the authority, I guess, unless you've delegated it away, to say, hey guys, we're going to start service at 9 a.m. 9 a.m. I want you guys to start the music, or 9 a.m. I'm going to do a call to worship. 9 a.m. is our start time. However, your authority ends in that local church sphere. What I mean by that is, you might have a young married couple in the church, and Bob and Susie. You don't get to tell Susie, "Hey, Susie, you're going to have dinner on the table for Bob at 5 p.m." Right? Dinner will be at 5 o'clock, and that's because your authority doesn't extend. It's a different sphere. Okay, so when we think about Romans 13 telling us to be in submission, Paul is speaking to people who, whether they're citizens or not, isn't really relevant. Most of them weren't citizens. They were just subjects. But he's talking about people just in their capacity as a resident, as a subject, as a citizen. But once you actually wear the baseball cap of magistrate, of delegated authority, things change a little bit. Now I have an obligation to carry out the roles that are proper to that, to that office. So, for example, the police officer. We don't want the police officer to turn the other cheek. That's what when he's wearing the badge and he's on duty. Now, in his personal life, just as an individual, Christian ethics, hey, yeah, turn the other cheek. But when he's bearing the sword as magistrate, then those personal ethics aren't quite the same. Now he has a duty and a role to play, and it's to bear the sword. Well, it's the same thing then with the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. Once you are the legitimate sword-bearing magistrate, you have an obligation to the people that you're in charge of. And so I think a really good example of this, or explanation, a sound explanation of this, and this is really what turned Grace Community Church back in 2020, was in part, their study of Martin Lloyd-Jones's commentary on Romans 13. When he preached through Romans 13, he spent several Sundays going through Protestant history, Protestant political history, and he really endorsed the American War for Independence. He found it to be proper, good and proper. And he was arguing from the doctrine of lesser magistrates. What Lloyd-Jones is arguing and what was basically understood was that, hey, when the colonies declared their independence, the people that did that weren't just commoners. They weren't just everyday citizens like you and I. They were the magistrates. They were the governors. They were the leaders. They were the appointed sword bearers. They were the elected representatives. And as such, as their duty to defend and protect the people under them, they said, listen, there's a threat that is above us, that's supposed to be of us, but they've really, this higher authority has turned against us, and we need to be faithful to our calling and defend our people from this threat up above us. And so that's kind of a long explanation of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. It's just recognizing not what we do as commoners, as everyday people, but what do we do if we are duly elected, legitimate magistrates who bear the sword? What is our responsibility? Is that helpful?
That's good. Now, when COVID hit, there was this reexamination of Romans 13, and what I don't want people to think is that all of a sudden a bunch of us decided we don't take Romans 13 seriously anymore. Far from it. But it's taking it in a real context. And maybe first listen, some people might say, well, you're not taking the text at face value. But if they really understood the argument, I think they would see that many of us who have come to this this understanding are, and that it's not some novel, crazy thing. I mean, think about it, and you hinted at this, Chris. The Bible tells us to submit to pastors. It tells us to wives to submit to husbands, and it tells people to submit to their governments. But what does the Bible also make clear? We must obey God rather than men. So whenever we're asked to sin by any of those authorities, we don't obey. And something that you just brought out is another time that we don't obey is when they are acting out of their sphere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And we actually operate that way all the time. We maybe don't realize it, but for example, if you, Sam, or one of your congregants was driving down the street and you looked in the rearview mirror and there is an NYPD trying to pull you over, you might pull over kind of out of curiosity. I don't know, but technically, I don't believe the NYPD would have jurisdiction in your town. They would be outside of their
Right.
sphere. Now, the NYPD, he's a legitimate magistrate, right? He has the authority to pull people over, but his sphere is limited. It's limited not only to a territory, but it's also, even within that territory, it's limited to a scope. And again, if you were in New York City and you got pulled over by the NYPD and he said, "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to give me all of your money, all of it," you would be within your right to say, "No, I'm not." Now, whether or not it's prudent is another issue, but their authority is limited. Or if that NYPD were to say, "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to your house, or we're going to go to your hotel room here in New York. You're going to cook me dinner, and then you're going to change all of your drapes to be purple." Now, I mean, sure, they could hold you at gunpoint and force you to do that, but you know that, wait a minute, you've not been delegated the authority to command those things. And really, that's how Romans 13 operates. When we talk about submission, there's a built-in understanding that authority is delegated to a person in a sphere, and even within their sphere, there's a scope, there's a purpose, and there's limitations. And so, subjection, that Greek word, hupotasso, it was a military term to arrange yourself under. And the idea there even being, listen, there's limits to the sphere of the person above you. And just because the person above you calls out a command doesn't mean they have the authority that you have to submit to that command. They might, but it requires that you think. And so hupotasso is first, I've defined it as it's the reasoned recognition of a delegated authority above you. And then that reasoned recognition of a delegated authority above you requires that you stop and ask, okay, has God granted them the authority to command what they are commanding? And many times the answer will be yes. Sometimes the answer will be, "You know what? No, Mr. Police Officer, you've not been given the authority to tell me to change the color of my curtains. It might be prudent for me to do it. You might be holding me at gunpoint, and I might have to find a way to deal with it later." But there's this built-in understanding of hupotasso, of submission, that God delegates authority into a sphere, and there's a limited scope to that authority. And what happens is sometimes and it's weird because we don't do it with the church authority, we don't do it with family authority, but for some reason with civil authority, we
Right.
picture it as if God has given them this unlimited sphere to command anything they want, with the only limits being they can't make you sin. And we're just kind of inconsistent, and we've never had to think deeply about it.
Right. So, like, for example, as a pastor, I can exhort people from the Word of God to be wise with their money and give them biblical principles. But if I go to a specific family and say, "Okay, I'm in charge of your bank account," no, that's totally ridiculous and absurd. A wife should respect and submit to her husband, but if he tells her that she can't worship God, she can't listen to that. And so the government has a specific, civil government has a specific sphere of authority, as you've said. They bear the sword. They punish evil doing. Let me just say this: like, when COVID happened, and the government, remember the government was trying to get us to wear masks, and that's a whole subject there. At first, I didn't really have. I know some people didn't like the mask thing from the beginning. It didn't bother me. I was wearing a mask. That probably bothered some people, but it didn't bother me at first. I didn't, but then I saw something really weird's going on, and I know there was debates on whether they help or whether they don't. That's not my area. But, was the government, like we said, like you had just said, Chris, like, we all realize that, well, I shouldn't say we all, but generally speaking, a Christian should understand the government can't ask us to sin. But when are they asking us to sin is the question. Were they asking us to sin when they they asked us to wear a mask. Well, some people might argue yes. Some people might say that it was interfering with social interaction. We're covering our faces. It's disturbing social relations. We're distorting our own image. I mean, some people, so that one might have come down to a conscience issue, but I will tell you absolutely where the government crossed the line. The mask issue, maybe a conscience issue. I don't know what your view on that, but I will tell you where I could say straightforward they crossed the line when they told us we couldn't meet for church. That they had no business doing. That was wrong.
Yeah, I would agree.
I'll admit we were closed down for months. I will admit that. Look, and I'll just say this because I want you to do most of the talking. In a true emergency situation, if there's an earthquake or something, yeah, the Sunday gathering may be postponed. And even in a situation where you have some kind of real plague, like the bubonic plague, we understand if our elderly people are going to stay home. But long term, you can't stop the meeting of the saints because that's going against Scripture. And, some of us need to be here because if we got something like that going on, I'm in the church right now, as this is where I'm sitting in the midst of the pews. We need to be here because at the very least, some people are going to need to pray, need prayer during these difficult times, and we're commanded to meet. So yes, there are emergency situations, but we know with COVID, that was not an emergency situation. At least, I'm trying not to get too much into the science of it, Chris, but at least months into it, it was no longer what they were saying it was. From the best I can discern, but what I can say dogmatically is whatever it was, it could have been the worst thing in the world. It could have been the worst thing in the world. You don't tell the churches not to meet. 100% no. Sorry, I get passionate about that one.
Well, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right because they're outside. There's a couple issues. They're outside of their sphere. Number one, God has not given the civil government authority over the church. Christ is the head of his church. He's delegated the authority over the assembled saints to the elders, not to the civil magistrate. And even if the civil magistrate is an elder, those are two different hats that he can't wear at the same time. You cannot act as a civil magistrate and an elder at the same time. When you're wearing your elder hat, you're representing the Lord Jesus Christ. You're not representing the city or the state or whatever. And then when you're outside of the church assembly and you're wearing the hat of civil magistrate, you're not functioning as an elder with the authority of the elders, out in the civil sphere. So, there's that issue. I think the way I've explained it and argued it kind of from the beginning is it's never wrong for local church elders to make the decision to close the church and to not have an assembly of the saints. And we do that with ice storms. We do that with, whatever type of, natural disaster. The elders have been given the authority to gather God's people, to teach God's people, to administer the ordinances, and in circumstances in which we look to experts outside of our own fields, and we say, you know what, from everything we're hearing, it sounds like it would be very, very hazardous for us to assemble. On that basis, we are going to not assemble this Lord's Day. God has granted the authority to the local church elders to make such a decision. However, I don't think God has granted the authority to the elders to appeal to Romans 13 as the reason to not assemble. So Romans 13 isn't speaking to the church. It's speaking to individuals on their individual capacity. And in their individual capacity, when a civil magistrate says, hey, you can't gather, civil magistrate, I'm sorry, but you're just outside of your lane. Civil magistrate says, Pastor, you can't preach. You can't administer the sacraments. You can't allow the people to gather. You must turn them away. You must lock the doors. The elder says, listen, I've not been tasked by God with being your enforcement arm. If you want to make those declarations, that's up to you. Whether or not you even have the authority to make those declarations is a whole nother matter, but I'm not your enforcer. And so I think it was always wrong to appeal to Romans 13 as the reason for closing. Now, we could say as elders, hey, the health experts, they have said, listen, you guys, they have said you must close. We've considered all the data that we can, and on the basis of the authority delegated to us by God, we are making the determination that the safest course of action for this week is to not assemble. Nothing wrong with that. And then you just go, week by week, and you see how things go. That's kind of not how it went for a lot of people. But again, we never had to think through these things. And again, we came from generations of having a generally benevolent government. We kind of, if we're honest, we had checked our anthropology at the door. We had forgotten that men really are evil, and evil people get into civil government, and they get into all kinds of positions of power. And we had kind of forgotten that, and it was kindly revealed to us.
So Romans 13 is written during a time where you have the Roman Empire. Nero was maybe the emperor during this time, and so there's really it's a very different governmental system than you have today. I mean, it's not that there weren't lesser magistrates, but
right.
I don't see any of the governors of that time going against the emperor. I mean, that's not going to happen, and I mean, that's not going to go good for somebody if they do that. But we live in a different form of government.
You did have at times senators would oppose, the emperor or the Caesar, okay. And so you did have times in which there would be opposition. As obviously as time goes on, the emperor gains more and more consolidated power.
Right.
But there was in the Roman Empire an understanding of the doctrine of lesser magistrates. There definitely was, but okay. Yeah, that's where that consolidation of power is.
Yeah, I'm not versed in that, so. No, I appreciate that correction, but that would make sense. But it definitely wasn't what we have today, right? Where we have this sort of representative form of government. And what you're basically saying is, let's just say this. This could be from a couple levels. If my governor is asking me or asking us, our church, to do something against God's will, I'll give you an example. I didn't want to get specific, but a number of years ago, Como was very strong during the COVID stuff, and there were all these rules about gathering for Thanksgiving, and there were. I know of at least one. I don't think he would have been considered a sheriff, but he was the head police chief in his area. He wasn't enforcing that, and he wouldn't enforce it. And so when our governor asks us to do things that are against our conscience or against God's word, we can appeal to our sheriff or our mayor, right, to fight back. And why would some Christians think that that's going against Romans 13? Because the lesser authority is an authority too. So why couldn't you do that? I don't get it. Why would they think that that's not obeying Romans 13?
Yeah, well, That's the hard part, right? Is that we've historically understood that we could do that, right? That's why we would appeal things to courts. Hey, Elijah, go back to Mama, please, right now. Yeah, she's gardening. I know. Go hang out with Mama, please. um, yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of times, um, a lot of times we reject things because of their misuse. So, for example, alcohol would be a good example. Um, can alcohol be misused? Absolutely, right? And it is, unfortunately, frequently. But the proper use of a thing does not negate, or the improper use of a thing does not negate the proper use. And so the same thing with having a robust political theology and having magistrates that we can appeal to and recognizing limitations on government. Can that allow people to then be, almost, anarchists, where they don't recognize any authority and where they make themselves the arbiter of where the government's authority begins and ends? Sure, people could do that, but that doesn't negate the proper use of thinking through those things.
Mm.
And so, even in our own country, and we don't put the Constitution above the Bible, of course, but we do recognize our own Constitution, put limits on federal authority, put limits on state authority. And so we recognize this stuff. It's just sometimes we're inconsistent and we haven't had to think deeply before.
Now, let me ask you this. The doctrine of the lesser magistrates, does that also work with higher magistrates? Let me put it to you this way. If my governor is asking me to do things that are against conscience or against God, can I appeal to a higher authority against her? Is it the same principle? So can I appeal to maybe I'm not being specific here, but can I appeal to the president, or can I appeal to the Supreme? For example, I mean, I live in a state that's very evil with abortion, New York State. And suppose that there's not, but suppose that there was a federal ban on abortion. Say the president outlawed abortion. But in my state, it was promoted. So could I, in this case, appeal to the higher magistrate against the lower magistrate? Can that same principle work with the higher magistrate?
Yeah, for sure. And some of it more has to do with lesser magistrate doctrine. It has to do with who we appeal to. Where it really gets controversial is, particularly going back to like the American, War for Independence. The question was, can Christians join in some sort of a revolution? Can Christians join into something like that? And and the answer was yes, Christians can join in because the person they're joining with is a legitimate magistrate, right? We're not just creating our own, militias. We're not just, going rogue here. We are actually operating under a legitimate magistrate. But yeah, we can appeal to the highest level. We can appeal to the lowest level. That's one methodology. The other methodology is just at times to just say, I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to do what you're commanding me, or God has commanded me to do something, so I'm not going to refrain from doing what you're telling me to refrain from doing. And then, I'll bear the consequences and I'll appeal. Elijah, would you please stop that? Hey, I know you're going to punch on the keyboard. I want you to go find Mama, please.
Is he punching? So, is he touching your keyboard?
Yeah. So I've got an extra.
My daughter does that all the time. Anytime I'm trying to, do work in the living room, she wants to. It's so cute.
Yeah, she sees Dad doing it, right? And so it's fun to copy Dad.
No doubt, if she was here, that's what she'd be doing.
Okay.
Well, brother, this would be a good point. You could finish your thought, but I was thinking, I know we had a number of questions, but I was thinking for this episode to end here, and then we could pick up with the third question in another episode. Would that be all right?
Sure. Yeah.
Did you have any finishing thoughts on this particular point?
No, I think if I were just to wrap up, and just say, Christians and politics, we just want to be as faithful as we can. We do want to love our neighbors. And one of the ways we can do that is to the best of our ability, understanding what's going on around us, understanding, what's in play, what are the consequences, and which path best represents the revealed will of God. I don't know what He's decreed, but I know what He's revealed, and there's some general principles that we can apply. And the same thing as I do with choosing a person to marry, or choosing a job, or choosing any variety of things. God gives us some liberty, and He sets some hard guardrails. And so we just want to be faithful in the office that we hold as voter, and just be the best stewards that we can, and do it together as Christians in the church, in the community, as a Christian community. And that way we can say, I did the best I could, and I didn't turn a blind eye, and I didn't hand my neighbors over to the God haters.
All right, well, really appreciate that. We'll call that one an episode. Thank you so much, and
Sure.
We'll plan to do another one. We'll talk about that after we close out. So thanks for being with us, and thank you for tuning in. Bye-bye. See you next time.